of it is solid. Everybody else was using a hay infusion, and that was like a broth culture, but he used the agar-agar that made the media solid, so we can now get petri dishes moving. Solid media was a big deal. And then he worked very, very hard on trying to interpret how disease happened. And what he generated were Koch's postulates. He really refined all of Rivers' work. Rivers did the experimental method, but Koch generated the postulates by which we work today in trying to do experimentation. And there are 4 of them. What he said was, there is always a specific organism in association with a given disease. There is always a specific organism in association with a given disease. So he identified the idea that there is an agent that causes disease. His second postulate says that organism can be isolated in pure culture. The agent can be isolated in a pure culture where there's nothing else but that agent. In other words, you can find out what the agent is that caused the disease. And this is how you would do it. Then he said that culture, a pure culture, can be used to reproduce the same disease in a susceptible animal. The same disease in a susceptible animal form, and that would, we could say human form there. And then, to prove that this is the correct agent, the agent can be recovered from the ill person. It can be recovered. So you can actually find it and say, yeah, that's the one that did it. Now that doesn't sound like a big deal, but it was a big deal because there had been no real way to check that, if you will, later on. And so his work was really important stuff. Really important stuff. He's followed on my list by Ehrlich. Paul Ehrlich. And now we're in the 1900s. We've made it to the 1900s. In the early 1900s, Paul Ehrlich worked very, very hard on certain diseases. And there are great stories of what happened to him. That's also, there are great movies that show him and working in the early 1900s. And he was the first person to isolate the tuberculosis organism because he was working on sputum, trying to grow the organism. By this time, Hans Gram had invented the Gram stain, and Ehrlich is working really hard trying to figure out what this organism is. But he couldn't do it. So there's a great story about how he was working in his laboratory, which was the porch of an antique house, heated by a little potbelly stove, and his wife called him for dinner. So he took the slides that he was working on and he put them on top of the stove and went in to have dinner. He was only planning to be there 5 minutes and he fell asleep. Wakes up an hour later, remembers the slides, rushes in to get them, and lo and behold, they have stain. Why? Because they are not gram-responsive organisms. They require an acid-fast stain, and the acid-fast stain requires heat. You will enjoy doing the acid-fast stain when we get to that point in laboratory. It's pretty exciting. So he actually found a whole new staining method. But what is remembered for the most is that he designed the magic bullet. Before Ehrlich, there was no material or agent used to treat a disease systemically. If you had an infection, they could pour carbolic acid on your infection. That felt good. but there wasn't anything you could take for the infection. So here's Ehrlich, who finds that if you use arsenic, arsenic will kill syphilis. And that was the magic bullet part. You had to take the arsenic in order to kill the organism. If you take too much of the arsenic, you get poisoned and die. If you take too little of the arsenic, you still have syphilis. Syphilis was, the diagnosis of syphilis was a death sentence. Because there are 3 stages. You see the skin lesions in the first stage. In the second stage, the organism goes underground, and you have other symptomology, like your skin peels off. In the third stage, it goes into your nervous system, accesses the brain, and you become crazy. And that's what people died of. Syphilis dementia. There wasn't any way to stop it. So, the opportunity to take a little arsenic looked pretty good. Except that the dosage was very difficult to stabilize, and a lot of people died. If you ever read Isaac Dinninson's book, Out of Africa, her husband, her beloved husband, brought syphilis to her. He got that from visiting the prostitutes in Paris. Went back to Africa, gave her syphilis. She kicked him out, came back to Europe, and was treated by Ehrlich, well not Ehrlich, but was treated by arsenic and survived. So she recovered from syphilis. Very unusual to do that. When we think about syphilis, we think of a venereal disease, right? Well, that's a term that doesn't mean syphilis. Venereal means transmission by sexual contact. Any venereal disease achieves transmission by a sexual behavior. That's what venereal means. In our terminology today, we call them STDs. Right? Sexually transmitted diseases. And they can be anything. Bacteria, viruses, fungi. If it's transmitted by sexual contact, it's an STD. So now we have a wide menu of STDs that we can look at. But in the early part of the 1900s, we had syphilis and we had gonorrhea. We hadn't expanded that to anything else. So what's really interesting is to look at some sociological studies of the lives of prostitutes in France in the 1800s. Courtesans were welcomed into the royal houses of Europe. Courtesan was a fancy name for a lady providing sexual favors, usually to a nobleman. And it was a fairly respected profession because noblemen impregnated these women and a whole bunch of illegitimate children showed up, but they supported them. They couldn't inherit a crown, but they supported them, and that's how they made their living. Why did the wives of these men tolerate courtesans, and why were prostitutes tolerated in the society at that time? Could you make a guess? Because they were. They weren't respected, but they were tolerated. Could you guess why they were tolerated, Robert?
Extreme poverty?
Yeah, well, there's definitely poverty, and the entry, or I should say the exit from poverty has always been provide sex for somebody. Right?
Maybe just their wives were only supposed to bear children and nothing else.
Yeah. And once they got infected, would the wives really want them to come home and have sex with them? No. If the old man wanted to go downtown for a week or whatever, that's fine, because that would be a week that she could not become diseased or pregnant. So it's very strange that the social order didn't repress the spread of prostitution. They were essentially outcasts from social mores because they weren't respected as people. But that's how it got to be a real thing. And if you look at the disease transmission it's actually not as high among prostitutes as you would think, because their behavior with their clients was very well proscribed. And it would go like this. The prostitute would wash, I'm talking about female prostitutes with male clients. We can do the male with male too, but let me do what the female was. The female prostitute would wash the organs of the prospective client with soap and water. She would wash herself with soap and water. The sex act would take place. She would wash him again with soap and water, wash herself with soap and water, and they always had a big jug of fluid, so they could have a lot of water coming in that would force the bladder to flush out the urethra.